Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 of SOCI 4002. This week we talk about the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. Before we do, I think it's worth clarifying what we mean by critical theory and the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School refers to a particular group of critical theorists, the original critical theorists, including figures such as Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and Walter Benjamin. Critical theory is framed as being in contrast to traditional theory, and we'll explain what that means in detail as we go through the lecture. What needs to be stressed from the beginning is while all Frankfurt School theorists are critical theorists, not all critical theorists are Frankfurt School theorists. Thus, we title this lecture The Critical Theory of the Frankfurt School, as there are other kinds of critical theory, predominantly associated with French schools of thought. This week, however, we focus on the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, which has its own distinct set of practitioners and its own distinct methodologies. The focus, as we'll draw out, is clearly upon dialectics, immanent transcendence, and a Western Marxism. So you can see from this image the key theorists of the Frankfurt School have one thing in common. They're all white men. But that didn't mean that racism wasn't something that was alien to them. In fact, the vast majority of the members of the Frankfurt School were Jewish, and the experience of the Holocaust was central to their writings. Race and class both feature heavily throughout the school of thought. Key figures we can see here include Adorno at the centre middle, Horkheimer at the top right, Benjamin at the bottom right, Marcuse underneath. Other figures included Ernst Bloch, Friedrich Pollock, Siegfried Krakow. We have a group of largely German Jewish intellectuals writing between 1930 to about 1970 and the main wave, the so-called first and second waves of Frankfurt School critical theory. Frankfurt School theory continues today, and there's debate whether or not it's in its third or fourth generation of authors. When people think about the Frankfurt School and they discuss it today in these classes, we tend to think more of this first generation of theorists, whose intellectual work, whose sociology, which drew upon a variety of traditions, heavily philosophical in its content, was of a unique potency and provided the meta-methodology of immanent transcendence, which we'll discuss in the following slides. I think it's important to provide some context historically to the Frankfurt School. As Adorno and Horkheimer write in their preface to Dialectic of Enlightenment, the central tenet of Frankfurt School critical theory is that the core of truth is historical. They were thus writing in a period from around about 1930s, 1940s, these key theorists. They're writing about Marxism and Marxist ideas after Marx's death. Marx died in 1883. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the attempt to create actually existing socialism in the Soviet Union, was influential on their thoughts. In contrast to a Soviet form of Marxism, which was relatively dogmatic and anti-humanist, Frankfurt School approaches were interpretivist and humanist, fascinated in understanding the social and human cost of domination. Frankfurt School theorists witnessed the move from attempts at socialist revolution, 1917 in the UK, in 1922, 1924 with the general strikes, with Jean Jaurès in France, to this move towards nationalism. After the 1929 Wall Street crash, we see Hitler coming to power 30th of January 1933. This movement, which is repeated time and time again historically between financial crash and the ascent of right-wing political parties. One could draw parallels between the rise of Trump, of Brexit, of Modi, of Duterte, of Bolsonaro in the wake of the financial crisis of 2009. From this movement that was witnessed from socialism to nationalism and the perceived failure of the Russian Revolution to provide a society which is worthy of the name of being communistic, we see this movement towards fascism and the Holocaust. One thing which fascinated the Frankfurt School and was central to their earliest inquiry, was that Karl Marx had been right about so much. He predicted that capitalism would go on to become the dominant form of political economy. He predicted this back in the 1840s. This would be like me saying today that a particular form of app would go on to dominate how everybody engages with everything. At the time Marx was writing about capitalism being the dominant feature in his society, it was very unusual. The vast majority of people in the 1840s worked still in agricultural labour. The idea that China and Russia would go on today to become an industrial economy, this seems infeasible for the vast majority of people in the 1840s and 50s. And Marx was also right that you would see the continuation of crises, gradually getting worse and worse. You've lived in your own lifetime through one financial crisis, 2008-9. Following the coronavirus, there's likely to be a substantial and prolonged financial crisis. Marx had been right that capitalism would spread. He was right that the degree to which crises would repeat cyclically and get worse, he got that right as well. Marx had been right on so many features, on the impact of reification and alienation on the social subject. But one central feature he got entirely wrong. Marx had predicted an imminent revolution, a move towards communism, a move away from capitalism. He predicted the immiseration of the proletariat, that people would get poorer and poorer and poorer until they had no choice left. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, the working men have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Why hadn't they? Why hadn't the working classes taken their world historical position, become what Lukács called the subject-object of history, and brought forward a newer, more rational society? The Frankfurt School was thus fascinated in trying to understand what had gone wrong. Why is it that Marx had been right on so much about the brutality of capitalism, its propensity for crisis, its spirals of debt? How come the historical progression had got stuck? This was the key feature which interested the Frankfurt School. And they drew upon Marx, they drew upon Freud, they analysed nationalism, they analysed the Holocaust, they introspected, they used a variety of different methods, drawing across sociology, philosophy, and aesthetics. Their central question, and the line for your notes, the Frankfurt School have one central objective: to understand why, instead of entering an age of civilization, an age of a fairer and more rational society, mankind had, and I quote, entered a new age of barbarism. It's worth providing some theoretical foundation before we explore the complex work of Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Fromm, Bloch, Benjamin, etc. Western Marxism is different to Soviet Marxism insofar as it isn't fundamentally saying, here's what Marx said, here are the books, how do we learn it as faithfully as possible to what Marx wanted? Rather, Western Marxism uses, as we encourage you to do, any sociologist critically, engaging with their ideas, seeing what's of use, and criticising that which isn't. This is exactly what we encourage you to do at university. We don't want anybody to be reading any text as if it is some kind of holy Bible. What we want is a critical engagement with the literature. In this regard, there is a tradition of Western Marxism which interconnected with the Frankfurt School's approach. Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks, written in 1910 to 1920, provided a grounding of an understanding of hegemony, an understanding of power and control which went beyond the usual confines of the political, which infiltrated the realm of society and culture. For Gramsci, what's important is controlling what is perceived as being possible, what is perceived as being viable and realistic. This, for Gramsci, is a particular form of power. He calls it the capacity to have that control of the paradigm, or in Gramsci's words, hegemony of paradigm, the capacity to determine what is thinkable, what is believable, the capacity to determine what is on the socio-political agenda. Lukács's work, particularly his History and Class Consciousness of 1923, is central to the Frankfurt School approach. Lukács was a Hungarian Marxist who was famous for his history and class consciousness, and later for his works on aesthetics and his work on the novel. In History and Class Consciousness, Lukács expands upon this idea of reification. The Latin word res means thing, res. Therefore, it may be easier for us to think of reification as thingification, the turning of human relationships, human properties, human capacities into things. The living, breathing, affective status of humanity is reduced and subsumed into a thingified state, lost of its breathing corporeality. For Lukács, capitalism is based on equivalence, something for something, a rational consideration. In this regard, all human relationships are transformed, transmogrified into things, to cold, instrumental, exchangeable, reified things. The cast of characters of Western Marxism is too large to do justice to here. I'd also point your attention to the works of Karl Korsch and Ernst Bloch. Bloch himself sits very much on the periphery of the Frankfurt School. I would read him as being a Frankfurt School theorist, whereas others would perhaps view his utopianism as being too far from the immanent transcendent methodology, which is broadly accepted to be uniting Frankfurt School critical theory. So let's nail down for our notes. What is Western Marxism? The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, the guys we're talking about today, drew upon something called Western Marxism. And Western Marxism draws upon the ideas quite strongly of Hegel. Remember, we spoke about Hegel in our first ever lecture, connected Hegel and Rousseau and Marx together. This is where they all come back together. Hegelian Marxism and Praxis Marxism are largely the same, so don't worry too much about this distinction. Hegelian Marxism suggests that we should understand the social world around us as a manifestation of a certain form of reason or of rationality. A capitalist society is a certain form of reason. What is seen to be natural, right, logical, coherent, fundamentally is manifest in broader socio-political processes. Western Marxism is thus sensitive to the Hegelian origins of Marxist philosophy and Marxist political economy. But it isn't simply a Hegelian Marxism. Western Marxism draws extensively upon Freud. For Freud, the move to civilization, this foundational movement away from being an animal to having rules and regulations, comes at a price. In his famous text, Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud suggests that this movement to civilization comes with an accompanying repression. The subject suffers for the peaceable nature of civilization, while they don't have to fear death and murder and starvation. The animalistic instincts, which we never lose, are repressed, introverted, twisted. For Freud, then, we suffer in civilization. And as Marxists with a sensitivity to Freud, such as Marcuse and Fromm, the marriage, this fusion of Marx and Freud, shows us that there is something particularly painful about the damage done to the ego by a capitalist society. We are unable to experience our true humanity when we suffer alienated labour. For Marx, there is something fundamental about being human, as we have established, which was to do things. We can't just sit at home and do nothing. We'll go home, watch Netflix, call a friend, speak to our mum, speak to our girlfriend, speak to our wife, whatever it is we do, we have to do something. Something foundational, says Marx. It is our species' being, it is our species' essence to do projects. And he uses the word labour in this regard, to make a difference in the world around us. The word labour today, as I said in the earlier lecture on Marx, sounds quite negative, but I don't think it needs to have that context. Could you imagine generally sitting there and doing nothing at all? You would go bonkers. Western Marxism is aware that there is something fundamental to being human about wanting to do things, wanting to be able to have control in how we impact the world around us. Whereas previously, in a feudal society, if you owned your own practice. You made your own saddles, you made your own bows, you worked when you want, you worked your hours, you had some connection as an artisan or a craftsman. You worked with your family, you had a connection with your labour. You could choose when you worked and how you worked. Of course, labour isn't always fun, and people would go hungry, and there would be misery and starvation. But the form of mental torture associated with wage labour for Marxists is qualitatively distinct. The idea there is somebody else who can tell you when to work, how to work, what to do, judging you, accounting for your time. For Freud, there is something fundamentally inhuman about this. Our capacity to repress our hatred of being controlled and treated in this way leads to a libidinal cathexis. It leads to a feeling of discontent, a feeling of rage, which can either be inverted in the production of a sadistic or masochistic personality type, or for Marcuse, it can become something which can be used as the basis to try and transform society. Alienation is thus a fundamental concern for Western Marxism, the impact on the social subject of the political economy. This isn't the same in Soviet Marxism, where the simple historical teleology takes precedence in the narrative. For Western Marxists, the concern is with ideology and reification, with alienation, with the libidinal cathectic drives of the subject. Western Marxism also unites Weber and Marx. The focus on the iron cage of reason, the one-dimensionality of thought, the increasingly instrumental and extractive engagement subjects have with their life world. For Western Marxists, this is epitomised in the damage that is done to culture. We'll talk about this more in following slides. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, a minima morale, a key text of Adorno and Horkheimer, society is understood to be trapped in its current irrational phase because the cultural domain has lost the capacity for penetrating social critique. The ability for the social subject to critique, to realise that something is fundamentally wrong with their way of life, has been lost. And this tragedy, the death of critique, the defeat of critique, this is at the core of Western Marxism and at the core of critical theory. With these foundations laid, it's time to now introduce the key figures of the Frankfurt School, particularly those of the first generation, the most famous Frankfurt School theorists. By far the most famous name associated with the Frankfurt School is Theodor Adorno. His work both as an independent author, such as Minima Moralia, his work on aesthetics, his work on music, but also his co-authored work with Max Horkheimer, such as Dialectic of Enlightenment, are undeniably some of the most important sociological texts ever written. Horkheimer was famous for the inaugural lecture at the Institute for Social Research, the opening of the particular brand of critical theory. His lecture, Traditional and Critical Theory, in addition to his work on the Eclipse of Reason, stated his claim as being a foundational Frankfurt School critical theorist. Other central names include Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm, who to varying degrees moved the focus away from political economy and sociology to psychoanalysis and to aesthetics. Marcuse and Fromm both competed in some regards to be the preferred heir of Freud. Their different reading of Freud's work was a source of much tension. Benjamin, in contrast, was an expert on literature, the messianic, and narratives of redemption. There is thus an interesting mix of ideas floating around within the Frankfurt School. Themes of political economy, of Marxism, of psychoanalysis, of religion, of eschatology. It was an interesting, heady mix of thoughts and ideas. As we'll see in the next slide, they are united by one central core theme, that of critique, and in particular, a particular type of critique, immanent transcendent critique. The aim of critical theory is, as the name suggests, critical. It seeks to provide a critique of the social world, to look at the totality of institutions, dynamics, and ways of thinking, to subject them to critical scrutiny. Critical theory thus seeks to be critical in two regards. One, it seeks to identify the problems that exist in the current social world, but also it seeks to make a difference. It seeks to make a change by the basis of conducting its critique, by the basis of disclosing the pathologies of the social world, its contradictions and irrationalities. Critical theory hopes to change the way people think about the world around them. The aim is by disclosing the contradictions within the social world, which are ideologically hidden. The social subject will move beyond a reified form of thought, be able to more clearly understand the social world in which they inhabit. This is a fundamental difference between traditional and critical theory, as was outlined by Horkheimer at his inaugural lecture. For Horkheimer, traditional theory, associated with positivism and a scientific account, is problematic, in that it proclaims an objectivity of the academic. Traditional theorists see themselves as independent of power, seeking a truth which is distinct from how they think about the world. They consider there to be a distinction between facts and values. The natural scientist, the savant, as Horkheimer dismissively terms him, exists in this bizarre hypocrisy of independence. The reality, says Horkheimer, is that the way we think about the world is always connected to power, is always connected to the conceptual way we engage with the world around us. Power and knowledge are never separable, and it's foolish for us to attempt to believe we can take part objectively in social analysis. A critical theory of society thus hopes to challenge domination. It hopes to change society for the better on the basis of disclosing its contradictions. Critical theory, unlike traditional theory, is explicitly political. It is aware of its locatedness. It doesn't pretend to have an objectivity which it cannot possibly possess. Critical theory is thus designed to produce a critique of society, to understand society as a totality, to identify its limitations and weaknesses, and by doing so, to push beyond them. But there is one fundamental unifying meta-methodology to critical theory, something which really connects disparate approaches and traditions, something I've mentioned repeatedly, and it's now time to explain: immanent transcendence. Critical theory has a particular kind of critique at its core. By critique, we mean a way of understanding and disclosing and engaging the problems that exist within the social world. There are two fundamental types of critique: immanent critique and transcendent critique. An immanent critique looks at the social world on its own terms and says, you claim to be doing X, here is what you actually do. This critique is immanent, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-T, with an A, not imminent, with an I. Immanent means of the world, whereas immanent means happening quickly. This is an immanent critique. The most famous example of immanent critique that's routinely used in textbooks is Ho Chi Minh's address to the Vietnamese who are occupying, to the French who are occupying Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh said, "You claim the importance of equality, fraternity, liberty to all men, but look how you treat us." Ho Chi Minh critiqued the French occupation of Vietnam on the own terms of the French occupiers. Immanent critique is thus located in an understanding of the internal contradictions within the life world, the internal contradictions that exist within society on its own terms. This exists differently to forms of transcendent critique, which somebody from entirely outside the social world comes in and says, I know how life should be organised, you should do this, this and this. For example, the way the Americans went to Iraq and Afghanistan and said, you should have this particular kind of representative democracy and capitalism. That's a form of transcendent critique. It says, your society doesn't fit my standards, rather than saying, let's look at your society and let's look at the contradictions which are at play and see how we can work through these to try and make society more rational, less dominating, and less reifying. Critical theory is very much invested in immanent critique. It seeks to look at society on its own merits, from its own terms of reference. but it seeks to achieve a transcendence. It seeks to move beyond what is located within the social world. By identifying the possibilities for rupture, by identifying the sites of contestation and conflict, by identifying contradictions within the social world, Frankfurt School critical theorists seek to transcend the reified consciousness of the life world. And these trends can be identified across all three waves of critical theory. Talk about the first generation, as we discussed, your Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Fromm. The second wave of critical theory is associated with the work of Jürgen Habermas. He brought together pragmatics, semiotics, and hermeneutics. His theory of commutative action is something you'll return to, particularly if you do theories of technology in my Sociology of Technology module in level 6. And recent critical theory, including the work of Axel Honneth and Rainer Forst, has moved away from some of the foundational and political values, moved away especially from the Marxian heritage of earlier critical theory. Honneth and Forst increasingly moved towards philosophy and intersubjectivity, sitting closer to symbolic interactionism, as we discussed last week, than to a Marxist conflict theoretical account of the social world. What unites all three disciplines are the core themes established in the previous slide, and particularly this commitment to understanding the social world on its own terms, identifying contradictions, and seeking a way of transcending these contradictions through disclosing the immanent incoherence of the social terrain. Perhaps the most central, the most intimidating text of Frankfurt School critical theory is Adorno and Horkheimer's co-authored Dialectic of Enlightenment, first written in 1944 and republished in 1949. The text critiques the false promises of the Enlightenment and critiques the instrumentalization of knowledge. The idea that we have a progressive horizon, that intellectual activity, that thought, particularly positivistic and conceptual thought, would lead towards human emancipation, was critiqued rigorously by the co-authors. For Adorno and Horkheimer, the scientific way of engaging with the world, viewing subject and object in abstraction, viewing the external world as stuff we can experiment on, ultimately led to a form of society in which human beings could be experimented on and seen as disposable, simply mere matter, as dead things. Writing as the true horrors of the Shoah or the Holocaust were becoming clear, the co-authors identified trends within Enlightenment thought itself, which were problematic and evinced what are referred to as social pathologies, foundational problems within our way of life, which cannot be consumed in the traditional liberal framing of justice or legitimacy. For Adorno and Horkheimer, modernity was itself a tragedy. What was required was still the rational critique of social irrationality, but the form of reason which was dominant, positivistic, enlightenment, extractivist logic, the way in which science had been proceeding for the past 300 years. Something was fundamentally wrong with how human beings thought about their place in the world. Capitalism, the bizarre state forms of state capitalism purporting to be communism within the Soviet Union, the horrendous forms of material violence committed globally that were being witnessed by Adorno and Horkheimer, the horrors of the First World War, which were still close in their minds, the move towards nuclear holocaust and the dropping of the atom bomb, the way in which mankind engages with each other and engages with the external world, that was the location of their social critique. There is thus a kind of Hegelianism gone berserk, run amok in this diagnosis. Fundamentally, the form of thought which had enabled Enlightenment progress for Adorno and Horkheimer had gone wrong, and something foundational needed to be changed, a move towards a non-subsumptive form of cognition was urgently required. Dialectic of Enlightenment contains two excursions or variations on the central theme. which go slightly away from the central arguments of the text. The most famous of these is on the culture industry. The phrase culture industry is probably one you've come across during your A-level studies, and if not, it's something you'll definitely hear again if you conduct modules on the sociology of culture with Ermac, or if you continue to take modules with me, such as sociology of technology. By the culture industry, Frankfurt School scholars suggested that the space for radical critique of society had been lost. Just as Pink Floyd's song Welcome to the Machine, which criticises the extractive, money-grabbing tendencies of the music industry, ultimately, by its success, went on to make millions for the industry it critiqued. You sit here listening to somebody tell you about the limitations of capitalism as expressed by Frankfurt School theorists, but you do so paying enormous amounts of money to a university, which is itself a capitalist institution, existing within a capitalist context. The extent to which there is a possibility for radical critique, Adorno and Horkheimer argued, was being lost. No space existed for critical thought. It was not part of the system. There was thus a repressive tolerance. Ideas would be shared. Critique of the system could be monetized, become part of the facade of openness. But the reality was terrifyingly totalitarian. Everything must be saleable, resealable. Everything must be packageable. It cannot be reduced to commodity. It cannot be reduced to number. It was mythic. As Adorno and Horkheimer write in Dialectic of Enlightenment, that which could not be reduced to number is mere fantasy. We thus see with this idea of the culture industry, the idea that everything has been dominated by the instrumental rationality of the capitalist system. You see here a clear fusion of Weberian and Marxist themes. A key tension existed in the first generation scholars. While Adorno ultimately became increasingly reserved, increasingly cautious about the possibility for revolutionary action, Marcuse, on the other hand, became a central figure for the student movements of 1968. While Adorno argued that attempts to force revolutionary action in such a totally commodified, such a totally capitalist society would be meaningless, Marcuse believed in the possibility of social change. He believed in something that was imminent, that could occur within the life world as it stood. Adorno thus offered a negativity, a retreat to thought, a retreat to critique, whereas Marcuse actively tried to inspire student movements and engage with a variety of ideas across the political spectrum. For Marcuse, what mattered was trying to reconnect with something fundamentally human, reconnect with these Freudian themes, this libidinal drive for something more, something unalienated. Returning to that immanent transcendent idea for Marcuse, the sense that people were working in demeaning jobs, experiences of racism or of homelessness, experiences of lack of possibility. By returning to the biological sense that something is wrong, by returning to the neuroses and anxiety which are made manifest by such a society, Marcuse thought there was the possibility of creating a new sensitivity. In an essay on liberation, Marcuse writes that we can create this new sensitivity by emerging ourselves in a new aesthetic, a new lifestyle, a new culture. In this regard, Marcuse's work can be seen as presaging the move towards the new politics and new social movements of the 60s and 70s. In conclusion, do we feel as though there is space for critique? Do we find Adorno and Horkheimer's understanding of the culture industry convincing? Is there a need for critique today? Kouvelakis, a leading critical theorist, has written a book in French which is translated as Critique Defeated. Is there the possibility for producing a meaningful critique of today's society? Is that possible within the neoliberal university? Is it possible when every voice, every song, every movie is sold marketed, Netflixified, loaded onto Zoom platforms, and sold to the highest bidder? Is it hopeless to seek a better world in which everything has been co-opted? Adorno writes, "Es gibt keine richtige Leben im Falschen." There is no right living in this false society where any attempt at critique will be co-opted by the system. Do we find this rather devastatingly cynical view persuasive? If so, why? And if not, why not? As always, I end on 3 questions for us to consider, which we'll return to in the seminars. Question 1, repeating something we were talking about in the previous slide. Is there no space left for critical thought which hasn't been co-opted by capitalism? Question 2, get it really into your heads. What is the difference that Adorno and Horkheimer believe exists between traditional and critical theory? And 3, this involves you doing some of the key readings allocated to this week. Do you find Adorno or Marcuse more persuasive? Thank you as always for listening to the lecture. A reminder, you can email me with any questions or comments to nharris@brooks.ac.uk. I look forward to discussing these ideas with you in the seminars.